Consider this. It's your wedding day. You're 12 years old. A stranger 3 times your age is about to become your husband. A man chosen by your father, a man you've met only twice in your life. But that isn't even the worst part. Before dawn, your mother wakes you. Her hands shake as she holds something you've never seen before, a spear. Not a ceremonial replica. A real weapon, one that, if the stories are true, has already pierced human flesh and drawn blood in battle. She uses its point to part your hair, strand by strand, whispering the same words her mother whispered to her on her wedding day. Tonight, do not resist. Within hours, you'll be dragged screaming through the streets of Rome while a mob chants obscene verses about what is about to happen to your body. You will cross a threshold smeared with wolf fat, enter a room heavy with incense and shadows, and lie on a bed placed deliberately in the most public part of the house. A knot will be untied that can never be tied again. This isn't fiction. It isn't the plot of a horror film. This was reality in Rome, ritualized and celebrated in broad daylight for over 1,000 years. Let's address the elephant in the room first. Just primogenitus, the supposed right of a lord to sleep with a vassal's new bride. You've probably seen it in movies, novels, or TV shows, Braveheart, medieval horror stories, all portraying the ultimate sexual exploitation hidden behind walls of power. Here's the truth. In ancient Rome, that specific practice is almost certainly a myth. Modern historians have scoured Roman legal texts, literature, and inscriptions. Nothing credible exists. No laws, no first-hand accounts, no archaeological evidence. It appears to be a fabrication, likely medieval propaganda, a projection of later society's anxieties onto the past. So, breathe a sigh of relief, right? The nightmare was just a story. Wrong. Because while that particular horror may be fiction, what actually happened to Roman brides was arguably worse. Not because it was more violent, though it often was, but because it wasn't hidden. It wasn't corruption. It was the system. It was law. Power, ritualized and celebrated, displayed openly for all of Rome to witness. The real horror wasn't that the rules were being broken. It was that everyone was following them perfectly. Abuse in secret is a crime. Abuse as law is oppression. Imagine being told that your terror is duty, your suffering tradition, and your body no longer belongs to you. This is the systematized, religiously sanctioned reality of Roman marriage. Women were property, transferred legally and ceremonially from father to husband. And it all began with a weapon. Dawn breaks on the wedding day of a young Roman girl. Let's call her Lucia, though her name is largely symbolic. She is 13. She has been betrothed since childhood to a man she barely knows, a 34-year-old minor official with political connections to her father. In a few hours, he will gain complete legal control over her body, her property, and her very existence. But first comes the hastikabaris, the celibate spear. In the pre-dawn darkness, her mother and household slaves gather around. There is no gentle brushing, no tender moment. Her mother produces a spear and begins the ritual that will transform her from daughter to wife. The spear is inserted into Lucia's hair, used to meticulously part it into 6 sections. Each section is braided with ritual precision, mimicking the hairstyle of the Vestal Virgins, Rome's most sacred priestesses. The process takes over an hour. One slip of the hand, one flinch, and the spear could slice open her scalp. Why a spear? The ancient philosopher Plutarch, writing in the 1st century CE, offers several explanations. Some claimed it honored Mars, the god of war, hoping the marriage would produce strong sons. Others said it symbolized Rome's strength, a gesture of military virtue. Plutarch also recorded a darker, symbolic interpretation. The ritual deliberately echoed Rome's foundational myth, the rape of the Sabine women. According to legend, Rome's earliest years were plagued by a shortage of women. To secure the city's survival, Roman men abducted women from the neighboring Sabine tribes during a festival. These women were forcibly married to their captors. Over time, the myth reframed the abduction as foundational to Rome's greatness, a story of female submission necessary for the city's survival. The spear in Lucia's hair was a living reminder of that origin. Her body, like theirs, was property, a tool to perpetuate the state. By the time the ceremony begins, Lucia is already conditioned. She knows her compliance is expected, her consent irrelevant. Her marriage is not an intimate union. It is a transaction, a public performance, and a rite of passage enforced by law, custom, and ritual. Every gesture, the spear, the braiding, the public procession, is designed to assert male control, erase female autonomy, and celebrate it openly. This is why Rome never needed to hide it. The system itself was the display. The public humiliation, the ritualized violence, the legal transfer of authority over her body. All of it was power, performed and sanctified, leaving the bride no choice, no recourse, and no escape. And it worked. For centuries, Roman law and ritual ensured that women like Lucia were legally, socially, and ritually subordinate to men. There weren't enough women. The surrounding tribes refused to let their daughters marry Romans, seeing the new city as a haven for criminals and outcasts. So Romulus, Rome's founder, devised a plan. He invited the Sabines to a great festival, a celebration of games and religious rites. The Sabines came, men, women, and children, expecting diplomacy and entertainment. Instead, at a prearranged signal, the Roman men attacked. They didn't kill the Sabine men. Not yet. Instead, they grabbed the Sabine women, dragging them away while their fathers, brothers, and would-be husbands were driven back by swords. The women were distributed among Roman men as wives. They were not asked, not courted, taken. According to myth, these women eventually came to love their captors, even intervening to prevent war when their birth families tried to rescue them. This story was not a secret. It became a foundational myth, celebrated in art, poetry, and crucially, reenacted symbolically at every traditional Roman wedding. The spear used in the ritual wasn't just for styling hair. It was a reminder, renewed with each marriage, that wives were fundamentally captured, that marriage itself was a conquest, and that a woman's body was a prize, sanctified by tradition. Some sources even specify that the spear should have already killed a man in battle, a weapon baptized in blood. Think about the psychological weight. The first thing to touch a bride on her wedding day is an instrument of death. The message is unmistakable: submission, ownership, and the inevitability of what is coming. To understand why these rituals existed, we need to examine Roman law. For most of Roman history, particularly during the Republic and early Empire, the most traditional and prestigious form of marriage was in manum, literally into the hand. From birth, a Roman woman existed under someone's potestas, their legal power. Her father controlled whether she could marry, to whom, whether she could own property, and even whether she could keep her children if she became a widow. An unmarried daughter, regardless of age, was legally like a child. The in manum marriage ceremony existed for one purpose: to transfer that power from father to husband. After the wedding, the bride was no longer part of her birth family. Not legally, not religiously, not in any way recognized under Roman law. She became, in legal terms, her husband's daughter. Any property she inherited became her husband's. Any legal disputes were handled by him. Her identity was subsumed entirely into his household. By the late Republic and during the Empire, a different form, sign manu, without the hand, became increasingly common, especially among the elite. In a sign manu marriage, a woman could remain under her father's potestas, or, if he was dead, gain a degree of legal independence. She could own property, conduct business, and wield autonomy. Some elite women became extraordinarily powerful this way. Yet even as legal realities evolved, the rituals persisted. Weddings were still performed according to the older in manum model. Why? Because these ceremonies were never really about the law, they were about power, tradition, and social control. A daughter's consent was technically required, but in practice it was meaningless. She had been raised knowing her father had absolute power over her marriage, that refusal would bring family shame, and that her options for survival were extremely limited. She would recite the traditional formula, ubi tu Gaius ego Gaia, where you are Gaius, I am Gaia. On the surface, it sounds like a beautiful vow of partnership. Its deeper meaning was clear: wherever you go, I follow. Your identity subsumes mine. Your world becomes my world. I am joining you. You are not joining me. There was one more physical symbol, one last lock. The cingulum, a woolen belt tied around the bride's waist, was fastened with the nodus Herculeus, the knot of Hercules. This wasn't decorative. It symbolized her virginity, her protected status, her body as sealed territory. The knot was deliberately complex, a puzzle to untie, representing the transition from daughter to wife, from property of her father to property of her husband. Every detail, the spear, the hair braiding, the formula, the belt, was a ritualized assertion of control. The bride was not a participant in her own fate. She was the object upon which power, tradition, and social hierarchy were displayed. The terror was public, systematic, and celebrated. Consent, autonomy, and identity were irrelevant. This was Roman marriage, and for centuries, every young girl entering it would experience the same combination of ritual, law, and psychological domination. And there was only one person with the right to untie it: her husband, on their wedding night. As the sun began to set, the most theatrical and psychologically brutal part of the Roman wedding began. The Dalum deducture, the procession to the groom's house. This was no quiet, dignified walk. It was orchestrated chaos, a deliberate spectacle of mock violence, reenacting step by step the legendary abduction of the Sabine women. First, the groom approached the bride. In front of both families, witnesses, and a crowd drawn to the spectacle, he seized her with visible force, pulling her from her mother's arms. The bride, for her part, was expected to play her role. She cried out, she struggled. Ancient sources claimed this was ritualistic. The bride's apparent reluctance was meant to appease the household gods of her birth family, assuring them she wasn't leaving willingly. But here's the haunting question. When does performance become reality? When does ritual fear turn into terror? For a 12-year-old girl, grabbed by a man 3 times her age while her mother screams, it is impossible to separate theater from trauma. The procession itself was a carnival of intimidation. Torchbearers led the way, massive flames flickering across the streets. Flute players marched alongside, their high-pitched music piercing the night air. Surrounding the couple was a crowd, friends, family, hired celebrants, and curious citizens. They sang Fessine verses, obscene, sexually explicit chants designed to be vulgar, ostensibly to ward off evil spirits. For the bride, these chants were not entertainment. They were humiliation, a public declaration of her transfer from father to husband. Other elements heightened the spectacle. Boys carried her spindle and weaving tools, symbols of the domestic labor that awaited her. Nuts were scattered along the route, fertility symbols meant to ensure children, but also a way to draw attention to the bride, emphasizing her objectification and the communal witnessing of her passage into her husband's control. Upon reaching the groom's house, the doorpost had been decorated, draped with woolen ribbons, and smeared with oils or animal fat, sometimes wolf fat, a symbolic callback to the myth of Romulus and Remus, raised by a she-wolf. At the threshold, the bride was not allowed to step over on her own. Tripping was considered a terrible omen, potentially dooming the marriage. So the groom lifted her bodily, just as one might carry captured plunder, and carried her over the threshold. Today, this is remembered romantically as the groom sweeping his bride off her feet, but in origin it was a display of dominance. She entered not by choice, but by force. Inside, the crowd remained outside, yet the shouting and crude songs continued for hours, growing more obscene as wine flowed. In the relative quiet of the house, the final, highly symbolic rituals began. The atrium, dimly lit with oil lamps and thick with incense, served as the stage. Positioned prominently was the lectus genialis, the marriage bed. Its placement was not private. It was in the semi-public heart of the home, a statement of the bride's purpose and the family's legitimacy. The bride was led to the bed by the pranuba, a matron of honor who had been married only once, a univira. This choice reinforced the ideal of fidelity the bride was expected to embody. At the bed, the husband approached and untied the knot of Hercules. This knot represented the bride's virginity, her protected status, and her submission. Untying it was a symbolic act of ownership, a final public confirmation that the bride had passed from one male authority, her father, to another, her husband. Every detail of the ceremony, the spear, the public abduction, the chants, the symbolic tools, and the knot, was a ritualized assertion of control. The bride's body, her labor, and her autonomy were subordinated to law, tradition, and male authority. Consent was superficial. Legal and religious frameworks codified her subjugation. The terror, humiliation, and objectification were systemic, celebrated, and enforced by community and custom. For centuries, girls across Rome entered into marriage under the same performative, controlling, and psychologically exacting system. The bride's body was now sealed territory that was about to be opened. Hercules himself was a symbol of masculine strength and virility, famous in mythology for his sexual conquests and for fathering dozens of children. The untying of the knot was not meant to be quick. Its complexity forced the husband to work at it while the bride stood waiting. Every second of that struggle was a reminder of what she was about to lose, what her body and autonomy would soon signify. When the knot was finally undone, her tunic loosened, and the next part of the wedding night began. The part history has sanitized, romanticized, or erased. Modern historians, particularly Paul Vane in his groundbreaking work on Roman sexuality, describe what followed with startling clarity. Vane frames it as a form of legal rape, a modern term applied deliberately to highlight the reality of Roman marital law. The concept of ongoing sexual consent within marriage, where a wife could refuse her husband, simply did not exist. Under Roman law, particularly in the in manum model, the wife's body was not her own. Her husband had both the right and the duty to consummate the marriage. Her role was submission. Her feelings, her fear, her discomfort were legally irrelevant. This was not a secret. It was the point. The wedding night consummation served multiple functions in Roman society. First, it legally confirmed the marriage. An unconsummated union could be annulled. Second, it established the husband's sexual rights over his wife, rights that would last the duration of their marriage. Third, it opened the possibility of legitimate heirs. The entire purpose of marriage, legally and socially, was to produce children, especially legitimate male heirs who could inherit property and carry on the family name. The bride's virginity was crucial. It ensured any child she bore was unquestionably her husband's. Her value was directly tied to her unopened status, her body as unmarked territory. On that bed in the atrium, surrounded by incense and shadows, that territory was claimed. Ancient sources are deliberately vague about the specific details of the act, and modern historians debate the level of privacy afforded to the couple. Some suggest witnesses might remain behind a curtain. Others claim the couple was left alone. The truth likely varied with period, social class, and family custom. What we do know is this: whether observed or not, the act was performed with the expectation of everyone present. This was not intimacy or love. It was law, ritual, and social obligation. For the bride, the first sexual experience could have been terrifying, painful, and confusing. Knowledge of female sexuality was rudimentary. Her comfort was not a priority. Most likely, it was frightening, especially for very young brides with little understanding of what was happening. Most importantly, it was a lesson in submission, a lesson about her new legal and social status, a lesson that her body belonged to another. In some periods, proof of virginity was required the next morning. Bloodied sheets might be displayed, publicly examined, or at least scrutinized to confirm the bride's status. The most intimate and private moment of her life became, in part, public property and evidence. If you followed this far, you're engaging with history's uncomfortable truths, stories sanitized or omitted from popular narratives. This content is exactly what we explore every week: the hidden, difficult, and often shocking realities of human societies. But why does this story matter today? Why isn't it more widely known? The answer lies in historical memory and cultural transformation. Rome itself did not erase these practices. Gradually, over centuries, pagan rituals evolved through cultural, religious, and moral shifts. With the rise of Christianity as the empire's official religion in the 4th century CE, these ceremonies began to change. The overt symbolism of conquest, the spear, the mock abduction, the Fessene chants, was replaced with Christian rituals emphasizing different values. But the deeper shift came through later reinterpretations. From the Renaissance onward, Western civilization developed a romanticized image of classical antiquity. Rome became a model of civilization, law, and culture. The darker realities, the ritualized domination of women, the public spectacle of their subjugation, were buried under layers of idealization. As a result, the psychological and physical control embedded in Roman weddings faded from collective memory. What remained was beauty, order, and civic pride. The violence, humiliation, and loss of autonomy endured, but largely unremembered. Understanding these rituals is crucial because it shows how power was exercised in human societies, long before modern legal systems. Women's bodies, their autonomy, and even their consent were systematically subordinated to law, religion, and custom. This wasn't abuse hidden in shadows. It was socially sanctioned, public, and reinforced by law, myth, and ritual. The story of the Roman wedding night is not a relic of the distant past. It is part of a continuum. Legal and social systems have repeatedly found ways to control women, to subordinate their autonomy, and to turn them into property, whether in ancient Rome, Tudor England, or elsewhere. The rituals of the in manum wedding night show how deeply such control can be codified, celebrated, and normalized. We studied Latin and Greek. We held up Roman philosophy, literature, and engineering as the pinnacle of human achievement. We celebrated the Senate, admired the aqueducts, and marveled at the Colosseum. And in doing so, we did what humans have always done with uncomfortable history. We softened it. We selected the parts we liked and quietly ignored the parts that made us uncomfortable. We remembered the aqueducts and forgot the spear. We celebrated the laws and overlooked the systematic subjugation of half the population. We glorified Roman art and military conquests, and chose not to think too hard about the women whose lives were circumscribed, controlled, and at times destroyed in the privacy of homes, the public spectacle of ceremonies, and the legal texts themselves. Modern popular culture has perpetuated this sanitized vision. Movies and TV shows set in ancient Rome focus on gladiators, emperors, military campaigns, and political intrigue. When they do depict marriage, it's usually romanticized, consensual, mutual, a meeting of equals. But the truth was far darker. For most Roman women, marriage was not a partnership. It was a transfer of ownership. A legal contract, sanctioned by religion, law, and custom, that erased her autonomy and subjected her to her husband's absolute authority. Even academic history, until relatively recently, largely ignored the female experience. Historians were overwhelmingly men writing about men, chronicling battles, laws, or political intrigues, leaving the private sphere, where women lived, labored, and suffered, largely invisible. It's only in the last few decades, thanks to the pioneering work of historians like Mary Beard, Sarah Pomeroy, Eve Damra, and Paul Vane, that the experiences of Roman women have been taken seriously. Using letters, medical texts, legal codes, and archaeological evidence, these scholars have reconstructed lives long ignored. And what they uncovered is deeply uncomfortable. Roman civilization, for all its achievements, was built on a foundation of systematic gender oppression. This oppression began at birth and extended through death, structuring family, law, economy, and religion. The wedding night rituals we've explored, mock abductions, the spear, the knot of Hercules, the Fessene verses, weren't aberrations. They were merely the most visible part of a much broader system. After her wedding night, a Roman woman's life continued under her husband's control. He controlled her property, her finances, her household, her social interactions, and her body. If he wanted sex, she had no legal right to refuse. If she committed adultery, she could be executed in extreme circumstances. If he committed adultery, there was virtually no legal recourse for her. Her worth was measured by her ability to produce legitimate heirs, preferably sons, and to maintain the family line. If she failed to produce children or only bore daughters, she might be blamed, shamed, or divorced. Her body was a vessel, a tool, a legal and social object, not a person. The psychological weight of this cannot be overstated. Imagine growing up in a society where every step of your life is predetermined by law and custom. Your education, your marriage, your economic options, your body. Imagine that your worth, your very identity, is measured in terms of reproductive value and obedience. And then imagine being expected to smile, to perform, and to celebrate the very rituals that reminded you, in public and in private, that your autonomy is non-existent. Why does this matter today? Because the echoes of these attitudes did not vanish with the fall of Rome. They flowed through the Middle Ages, shaped medieval European marriage practices, influenced the development of Western legal systems, and created narratives about gender roles that persist. The idea that a wife's body belongs to her husband, codified in Roman law, lingered for centuries. The belief that a woman's value was tied to her virginity, her fertility, and her obedience shaped cultural attitudes for generations. Marital rape wasn't criminalized in all 50 U.S. states until 1993. Think about that. Less than 35 years ago, the legal system in some parts of the world still reflected, consciously or unconsciously, the principles established in ancient Rome. Even today, remnants of these ideas exist culturally. Fathers giving away daughters at weddings is a symbolic echo of the Roman in manum transfer. Societies continue to prize female chastity and fertility over autonomy. Social norms still dictate the extent to which a woman can claim ownership over her own body, property, or reproductive choices. Understanding the origins of these traditions is not academic nitpicking. It is necessary for dismantling them. The Roman wedding night, with its spears, its mock abductions, its public spectacle, and its legal consummation, is more than history. It is a mirror. It reflects a society that openly celebrated control over women. It reflects the mechanisms of power that persist in various forms to this day. And it also reflects the resilience of women who lived within these systems, survived them, and in some cases, even found ways to assert agency in constrained circumstances. Consider the subtle resistances. Some women, even under in manum, exercised influence over household finances, guided political alliances, or managed property on behalf of their husbands. Others negotiated dowries or managed businesses while their husbands were away at war. Even small acts, refusing certain domestic tasks, controlling money behind a husband's back, or instructing children in ways contrary to paternal orders, were forms of quiet rebellion. They remind us that human agency never vanishes entirely, even in the most restrictive systems. And yet, for every act of subtle defiance, there were countless instances of trauma, exploitation, and loss. Thousands of girls like Lucia existed across centuries of Roman history. Their fear was real, their pain was real, their autonomy was systematically stripped away. And the fact that history chose to forget them, to soften their stories, to turn ritualized trauma into romance, is also real. Remembering them is an act of historical justice. Not to condemn those who lived 2,000 years ago for failing to meet modern moral standards, but to understand how these systems were deliberately constructed and maintained. To see how progress, legal, social, and cultural, is never inevitable. Rights and autonomy must be fought for and defended against deeply entrenched systems of power, often justified as natural, traditional, or sacred. The spear is still there, buried in history. The ritual, the mock abduction, the public spectacle, the control over the body, they were not mistakes, oversights, or anomalies. They were deliberate tools of social order. Today, at last, we can see them for what they were. Not ceremonial hairpins, not quaint traditions, but weapons, mechanisms of control, and truths we must reckon with. And that reckoning begins with telling the stories Rome celebrated, but that history tried to erase. Understanding this is essential not only for historians, but for anyone interested in the long arc of social justice. When we see the connections between ancient rituals and modern structures, we can recognize the ways culture, law, and custom have historically worked together to limit human freedom. More importantly, we can see the ways those structures can be challenged, rewritten, and dismantled. Rome's lessons are not only cautionary, they are instructive. So when you think about Roman history, think beyond the aqueducts and the emperors. Remember Lucia. Remember the thousands of women whose lives were governed by law, ritual, and custom. Their experiences, silenced for centuries, remain with us through their echoes in law, culture, and tradition. And the first step in change, as always, is seeing clearly.